Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about US-Iran tensions once again on Newswire. We've got a great panel of experts waiting to give their opinion here. But let me just give you a brief idea of what's going on right now. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been on a whirlwind over tour since Sunday, visiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and now India. Pompeo held talks with Saudi leaders in Jeddah on Monday, while in the backdrop, tensions between regional foe Iran have been on the rise since Tehran shot down an unmanned American spy drone above its territorial waters. Now, Pompeo says under discussion with the Arab leaders were concerns for maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz, a key oil shipping route in the Middle East. U.S. has imposed new sanctions also on Iran, on the Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, with Mr. Trump saying is a response to Tehran shooting down the U.S. drone, as well as many other things, quote unquote, Mr. Trump said. But what were these many other things? What does Trump's hardline B team have on its agenda in rallying regional coalitions to stop Iran from building up its nuclear arsenal and what Washington calls its sponsoring of terror in the Middle East? This and more coming up in Newswire today. Let me introduce our guests. We will be talking to Dr. Abdulaziz Al Ghashian from Essex University. He's a research fellow in Saudi foreign policy at Essex in UK. Also, we have Dr. Foad Izadi, assistant professor at the University of Tehran. And also on the line, we have Ms. Setareh Sadeqi, a researcher with a PhD candidate also in American Studies, University of Tehran. Welcome to the show. It's so good to have this great panel of guests here. I want to start with you, Dr. Fawad. The current situation, what exactly, in your opinion, is Mike Pompeo's agenda there? What do you think came out of this meeting that he had with the Saudi king and also later in the UAE?
The U.S. government is interested in overthrowing the Iranian government, and they want to put a lot of economic pressure on Iran. So people become tired and demonstrate and cause a sort of a revolution or a color revolution. That's the basic aim. There are some people in Washington that are also interested in a military confrontation with Iran. People like John Bolton have called for a military strike before he got his current job.
Okay.
So given the current situation, the U.S. is using all its instruments to reach these foreign policy goals, and creating coalitions against Iran is going to be one policy tool. Unfortunately, countries like Israel are very much willing to help U.S. in fighting Iran, and that's why Pompeo is in this.
What about the countries in the region who are not in favor of this coalition? Are those prominent enough to take a stand right now behind Iran, or just generally on the agenda that U.S. is supposedly on in cornering Iran until it crumbles?
Yes, we have countries like Pakistan, Qatar, Iraq, Turkey, basically all of Iran's neighbors are opposing this type of measures. There was a concern about Iran's nuclear program. Iran had the nuclear agreement. It was the United States that left the agreement without any justification.
Right.
So the problem that Iran has is that they realize whatever they do, the sanctions are going to be with Iran. The United States is not satisfied with Iran's actions, no matter what Iran does.
Right.
And that's why we have a situation where resisting U.S. pressure is the only option.
And the latest sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. on the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, and 8 other senior military dignitaries of Iran. And also now we're hearing that the foreign minister, Mr. Jawad Zarif, will also be sanctioned a little later in the week. What do you make of this? What kind of an effect does it have on Iran's economy, which is already seeing its worst time?
Well, they call it coercive diplomacy. In this case, it's all coercion and no diplomacy. When you put the foreign minister of a country on a list of sanctions, that means that you're interested in reaching any type of political settlement. And what Iran has shown with shooting down of the very highly sophisticated American drone is that Iran has the technology, to fight U.S. and it's willing to use that technology, use the instruments, military instruments, to defend the country.
Okay.
So that's the only option that Iran has, basically.
Which is pretty much no option, as it seems. Thank you so much, Dr. Foad, for your insight there. I'm going to come to you, Setareh, to try and understand this concept of coercive diplomacy, which some world leaders across are saying there is no room for diplomacy left. What's your take on this?
Well, that's has been properly pointed out by other analysts as well, that it leaves no room for diplomacy. When you impose sanctions on the highest level of the politicians of a country, as well as the people of a country, it means that you want no dialogue with them. You just want them to surrender and act based on the U.S. desire, or you will leave them with the option of a military attack. This is basically an economic war already launched on the Iranian people.
And Russia has already come out and said that these new sanctions are actually illegal. And they've closed the door, according to Foreign Minister Javid Husain, that there's no way now we're coming to the table. So do you think that was the end goal, essentially, that President Trump had in mind?
Well, it's very difficult to know for any U.S. politician, but especially for President Trump, what he's exactly pursuing, because he can change his mind over a few seconds. Like in the case of the U.S. that has been downed by the Iranian government, Trump said that they have been prepared for a retaliation, but only 10 minutes before starting the attack, they decided to figure out how many people are going to die in that attack. So
well, that's a really interesting point. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought there, Mrs. Setareh. I want to come back to you and talk a little more about Iran's economy that's being affected. But here, Dr. Abdulaziz, let's talk a little about President Trump's statement that I held off this strike last minute while we were, as he famously said, cocked and loaded, because 150 Iranians' lives were on the line here. Let's be very clear here. What's your take on it? Do you think this is exactly what he meant, or the fact that it would have been going against not only the UN Security Council's charter, but also his own constitutionally mandated congressional approval to make any kind of such strike on Iran?
I think, well, firstly, good afternoon to you all, to you and your guests. I think the withdrawal of the decision to commence with the military activity is one that I think went with one that supported the already existing policy of trying to apply pressure on Iran. Now, the reason why is that because if there was a military confrontation, or if he did commence with the military activity, I think this would have legitimized the Iranian calls, and at least the Iranian calls in the international realm, to meet this resistance with the resistance, to meet this fire with fire. It's very much I think a game of perception at the minute, or a struggle of perception. There has to be, Iran has to look like the troublemaker. And if one uses means to try to, the same means that it is very much criticizing, then this is going to legitimize this is going to legitimize the hawks in Iran.
Right, I see where you're going with this, but here's the problem here. When they're trying to build a narrative in a world which is right now touched by technology in a way that you really can't escape the news, whether it's propaganda or real. And here you have Iran's ambassador to the UN while filing a complaint to the UN Security Council, saying that we had warned this drone several times before striking it down, and we deliberately didn't touch the plane that had 8 Americans on board. So really, is that getting conveyed, or is President Trump really not affected by what kind of image gets portrayed of him?
No, I think if anybody is affected by image, I think it is Donald Trump. But I think here it is the advisors that have tried to convince him at the last minute to say, listen, right, because the Trump administration is very much like the kind of apparatus in Iran, right? There's a cacophony of voices happening. And this is the result. This is what happens. Because in Iran, there are this mixture of people calling for closing the Straits of Hormuz to try to meet the American resistance. And we heard that from the first guest, the honorable guest. And he said, we can meet this, we can use force, that we can fight. This is, and although everybody has a right to be proud and
right,
defend
but Iran's made it clear now they're not coming to the negotiating table. So what do you think is the next move by Iran?
Well, the next move in Iran is going to try to counter this this diplomatic effort with another diplomatic effort. Moreover, I think it's going to be a waiting game for Iran, because now this anti-Iranian bandwagon, this anti-Iranian effort by Donald Trump is a Trump legacy. Okay. And this is, they're going to wait for another president, hopefully, that can try to change the rapprochement. Just like how Iran was viewed as an Obama legacy by Donald Trump. He was viewed as, Iran, every time when he mentions Iran, he mentions Obama, right? So I think now it's a waiting game, and it's also what the next procedure or the next kind of trajectory that I think Iran should take or would take is that it's not going to take any activities that will make it much more difficult for negotiations in the future. Right. At the minute, negotiations are very unforeseeable. Confrontation and antagonism is extremely high. The United States proved that it is still the most dominant player in the Middle East, despite all the rhetoric beforehand. So I think it's a waiting game for Iran.
It is a waiting game right now, it seems, and it's been a waiting game for a while. Talking about President Trump's latest tweets coming out, where he's also said that's not just the U.S.'s responsibility to bear the cost of making the Strait of Hormuz secure, in terms of it being one of the biggest shipping lines, oil shipping lines in the world. But at the same time, we see Mike Pompeo in the Middle East really trying to rally support from his allies. What do you make of this juxtaposition of two approaches here?
Well, the juxtaposition is a characteristic of the Trump administration. I think we have to understand that and expect that every time that happens.
So pretty much discount what President Trump is saying about they don't need the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, why is he saying that? This is my emphasis, and the reason why he's saying this is he's adhering to the domestic politics that he has. Right, he's allowing the diplomats or the people that are playing the role of diplomacy do the diplomatic nitty-gritty work. Give them, the allies, what they want to hear, and perhaps give them the reality of what they want to do. At the same time, Donald Trump, the symbol, the president, 2020 person, is going to say the notion and adhere to the notion of make America great again. This is all domestic politics. So what we're seeing is a balance between domestic politics and foreign policy. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdulaziz, for your great insight there, joining us from the UK. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Setareh. We're talking about how these sanctions are affecting life in Iran. You're based in Tehran right now. The IMF says in 2019, the economy will shrink another 6%. Youth unemployment is closer to 30%. And also, cost of food and medicine is somewhere up by 40 to 60%. Tell us a little, give us an insight on how life has changed since sanctions this past year.
Well, since due to sanctions, foreign exchange is not entering the country as much as it used to do before, it's making it very difficult for the government to create job opportunities. And as you mentioned, the everyday life of the people has been affected, especially, for example, the sanctions on medicines and humanitarian aid has made it very difficult for patients with special diseases to provide for or even find their necessary medicines. So this is increasing general public's, the Iranian public's.
And this is making them really angry towards their own regime, is it not?
And also the U.S. They are blaming Trump. They are fed up with U.S.'s aggression. And yes, they have their grievances against the current government because they believe that the country has enough capabilities that can be used to create job opportunities and settle the economic problems. And this is something that the people are expecting from their own.
So the anger towards the government is that it is not being as self-sufficient as it has a potential to be, or the fact that it's not coming to the table in stopping this spiraling of the economy and the high unemployment rates, etc.?
It's because of not using the national potentials, because we have been under sanctions for over 40 years. And although these sanctions have been escalated and more severe recently, but this is nothing new. And we have to develop an economy which is not so much reliant on oil exports. We have always been predicting that this could happen at some point because U.S.'s aggression towards Iran has always been in place.
All right. Mr. Setareh, stay with us. We're just joined by Mr. Tom O'Sullivan. He's the energy and security consultancy, Matthews Advisory, and he's joining us from Japan right now. Thanks, Tom, for joining us. Let's talk a little about what oil plays a role here in the U.S.-Iran tensions. Now, while oil did fall a little bit on Tuesday amid concerns on what the outlook would be like for demand in terms of demand, but we are reading reports across the board coming in that there are spikes in oil and oil products prices whenever there is a major event between U.S. and Iran. What's your take on this? What could be the reason behind this?
Right. Well, yes, Ayza, hi from Tokyo. Well, as you know, for example, the Japanese Prime Minister was in Tehran mediating on June 12th and 13th this month, and a Japanese tanker was hit outside the Hormuz Strait. So, after that incident, 10, 12 days ago, oil has jumped by about between 10 to 15%. So yes, anytime we see, any military activity in the region, prices do tend to rise, particularly, the Brent crude price. Yeah.
So when prices rise like this, could you say there is an unprecedented change, or is this something pretty normal to world events?
Well, it's normal, in terms of, activity, military activity like this. But obviously, in the background, we have these ongoing trade negotiations between the United States and China. And of course, I'm based in Tokyo. Japan will be hosting the G20 next weekend. So we expect some discussions around that. But that is also impacting oil prices and oil demand, oil supply, etc. And of course, Japan is also extremely dependent on exports from the Persian Gulf. 80% of the oil that Japan uses comes through Hormuz every day, and about a third of its LNG also comes through the Hormuz Strait.
Okay, so Mr. Tom, tell us this. Hypothetically speaking, God forbid this ever happens, if U.S. were to make a military strike on Iran or its whereabouts, what do you think would happen to the global oil prices and as a result to the economy?
Yeah, well, I think we could see a spike up to $100 a barrel, and of course, then that would also probably open up the possibility for a very huge gap between WTI and Brent, up to maybe $25, $30 a barrel. At the moment, we only have, a $7 per barrel differential. So that could be one possible outcome. Of course, as I mentioned earlier today, U.S. production is having a dampening effect on oil prices globally. We're seeing record production in the United States. So that's helping to
But let me rephrase that. If you could, let me rephrase that. Would there be any winners? And are there any winners right now to having essentially brought down Iran's oil production to zero? And Iran was a pretty big contributor up until these 2018 sanctions. So who would be the winners here for this situation?
Yeah, well, of course, your next door neighbors, Ayza, India, for instance, seems to be moving part of its supply into Russia. So now it looks like a lot of the supply that's fallen out of Iran is actually, in India, for example, will be replaced by Russia. So potentially Russia could be a beneficiary, because of this situation. And, we were going to see OPEC countries are meeting on Monday and Tuesday next week, and Russia will also be attending those meetings. So we're going to see what happens because of these developments in the Gulf Monday, Tuesday next week, and then the impact on oil prices as well. Unfortunately, even with oil prices, relatively speaking, a little bit higher than they were 2 weeks ago, a lot of the Gulf countries are still below their break-even levels in terms of fiscal break-evens.
So thank you so much, Tom. Great points there. Here, I'd like to also welcome another guest who's just joining us. We have with us Mr. Ross O'Leary. He's an American politics expert. He's joining us from Dublin. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ross. Let's talk about U.S. President Donald Trump and his wonderful B team, who's been targeting Iran continuously, while at the same time urging them to come to the table, to negotiate. They're ready to make best friends with Iran, but they're saying you better not have any preconditions when you come to the table. What is really happening here? How much of this is the elections 2020 and trying to keep within that time frame? And how much of it is a situation that is rapidly spinning out of control?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It really is a situation that is spinning rapidly out of control. I believe yesterday the Iranian president said, you sanctioned the foreign minister simultaneously with the request for talks. So I really think that the Trump administration's policy towards Iran is completely misguided. You have the economic rhetoric from Donald Trump saying that he wants to essentially stranglehold Iran and all the Iranian officials. But then you have the hardliners around him like John Bolton who want military intervention. And as you mentioned, the 2020 election is obviously something that is massively playing into Donald Trump's mind, and the optics of every decision he makes, really what matters to him most is making sure that his base will stand out and support him. Now, I thought initially with the response to the two oil tankers and then the downing of the drone, that the Trump administration were testing the waters, seeing that if his base would follow along and say, well, we support Iranian intervention or American intervention in Iran, that it would be a sure thing. However, this morning, a Politico and Morning Consult poll shows that 59% of registered Republicans support intervention in Iran, which, although a majority is not big enough to justify Trump, I suppose, sacrificing the wants of his base. But I think, as I mentioned, the optics of 2020 are playing massively into his mind. But we can't forget that, historically speaking, being at war has been very helpful for previous presidents to win re-election, especially with the incident in the Gulf of Oman last week. That was very reminiscent of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which allowed LBJ to invade Vietnam. And then also, of course, the war in Iraq helped George W. Bush to win re-election.
But do you think since then, sorry to cut you there, but do you think, Mr. Ross, since then things have changed a little bit? The global sort of mood towards how U.S. takes on its policy, especially since Trump came into power, has changed a bit. I mean, we're seeing Russia call out very openly that these sanctions itself that have been imposed on Monday are super illegal. EU is trying to continue its steps in trying to establish INSTEX as fast as it can. So do you agree with this, maybe, that the situation is not the same, to expect the same from the alliances this time around?
I think so. And what I found quite surprising is Trump's endless rhetoric on him not wanting these pointless and endless wars, yet then would toy with the idea of invading Iran. His base are openly supportive of ending the occupation of Afghanistan. So to be honest, I don't really understand why he's even teetering on the idea of military intervention, because it's something that he ran his 2016 campaign on. But I think what it is representative of is the fact that he has one, a completely misguided foreign policy, but two, these hardliners like John Bolton surrounding him who really want regime change. I think the only way to go about that is by military intervention.
Okay. No, but the B team is now, there's a new person added just on the job on the crux of what is the U.S.-Iran tension. That's Mark Esper, the U.S. acting Secretary of Defense. Do you have any hope from him, or do you think he's got pretty much the same agenda as Pompeo and Bolton?
I would assume so. I think the days of hoping for a cohesive foreign policy from the Trump administration are sadly gone. However, again, we can hope as much as we can, and we'll just have to wait and see. But I think kind of coming on from the sanctions that were placed a couple of days ago, I don't really see much of a change.
You don't see much of a change. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Ross. We're also joined by the former ambassador to Iran, Mr. Javid Husain. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. Let me just ask you this. How is this affecting Pakistan?
Well, American sanctions on Iran have adversely affected Pakistan-Iran cooperation in economic and commercial fields. The prime example, of course, is the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline project, which has been held up where Pakistan has not been able to fulfill its part of the implementation of that project because of the fear of U.S. sanctions. So this is one thing. Secondly, our oil imports from Iran have come to a
grinding halt.
Grinding halt. And there is hardly any trade now between Iran and Pakistan because of U.S. financial sanctions. So these sanctions have had a very, very serious negative impact on Pakistan-Iran economic and commercial cooperation. And going forward, if these tensions between Iran and U.S. and general tension in this region, the Persian Gulf region, lead to some kind of outbreak of armed conflict, then, of course, they will have even further negative impact on Pakistan's security and economic well-being.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Javid Husain, a former ambassador to Iran, joining us in Lahore. We are now joined by Dr. Rasul Rais. He's a professor of political science here in Lahore. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. We're talking about how escalation between U.S. and Iran creates an atmosphere where there is a very real possibility of something going wrong, an attack happening. How would this affect the peace in the region, in your opinion?
I don't think that peace that must prevail in all regions of the world is prevailing in many of the states in the Middle East. We see civil wars going on at different levels in different areas of Syria.
Okay.
Similarly, there are divisions and confrontations within Iraq. And you see the situation in Sudan, that there has been a military takeover and there is a resistance against that. There is a war and civil conflict in Yemen. And most of the major powers in the Middle East, these Muslim countries, which are rival to each other, are engaged in intervention and counter-intervention. They are using proxies.
They're using proxies. Absolutely. That's a scenario that does exist. But at the same time, Pakistan is directly affected. I mean, in April, Imran Khan just visited Iran. There seemed to be a very good sort of reception. It went really well. But here we're looking at a situation where U.S. could attack Iran. And if that happens, where do you think Pakistan will stand? Will it be on the same page as an ally to the U.S. providing bases for this, air bases for such an attack?
No, not at all. I think we should not even think about that. If that happens, I will be highly disappointed. Because Imran Khan, in the light of the debris of Afghanistan's wars that have fallen on Pakistani side and has been for the last 40 years, has said that in future Pakistan will not be part of any other country's war. So why would Pakistan like to be a partner of the United States against a neighboring
for the fear of
country
sanctions,
like
maybe?
Iran? So I don't think that is going to happen. We will not be on the side of the United States, but there will be pressures from both sides.
There will be pressures from both sides.
The Saudi-led alliance.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Bakhsh Rais. Unfortunately, we had to cut him off there. We've run out of time with that. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now we'll be talking about another country that has been under discussion, making the headlines continuously, and this is Sudan. Right now, Sudan's opposition announced plans for more mass demonstrations after the country's ruling generals rejected an Ethiopian proposal for a transitional government. On Monday, Sudan's ruling Transitional Military Council had rejected this plan, which effectively to end the political deadlock over the composition of a new government was floated earlier. Now, instead, they said what could be done was to salvage this by merging the Ethiopia proposal with that of an earlier option offered by the African Union. Now, this is, of course, a problem because when the Ethiopia plan was offered, the civilian opposition had accepted it. The plan centers on forming a transitional government, a kind of a sovereign council, you could say, comprising of 7 civilians and 7 members of the military, with 1 additional seat reserved for an impartial individual. So what we will be discussing with our guests today is the future of Sudan, as once again impasse between the ruling military junta and the civilian protesters and opposition parties has been brought into the process of the democratization of Sudan. I'd like to welcome my guests here. We have with us Dr. Marwa Gibril, an activist who's joining us from London. She earlier on was living in Sudan. And also we have Dr. Ahmad Mclad, an analyst who's joining us from Sydney. Let's start with you, Dr. Mclad. Let's talk a little about this current move. What is it for the opposition parties or the Sudanese who are now already planning for protests? What is it for them if they were to follow what the Sudanese military is saying to merge these 2 options?
Well, we've been dealing with the military council for a while now, and we have seen the same attitude of al-Bashir regime as if it hasn't changed. We could see clearly their intentions. Mm-hmm. They do whatever to waste time, to try to, look into the smallest of the tiniest things to refuse and reject and delay times of negotiations.
Right, so you're saying the attempts by the military junta is not genuine, but if you could spell out for us, what is the biggest opposition to this merging of the 2 plans?
It is not about the merging of plans. Even the merging of plans, they don't aim to reach a conclusion. Because meanwhile, what they're actually doing using the national TV in Sudan, they are actually trying to, promote themselves as the only saviors of Sudan and the only, option for the Sudanese people to have peace in Sudan is that they remain in leading the country. So this is what they're actually promoting in the local TV. They're cutting the internet and they're actually delaying any real international deal. Meanwhile, they're promoting themselves to the local communities, the poor communities, the leaders of the small tribes around the country, and then on local TV, they're promoting themselves as the only rule that can save Sudan from killings and the unrest.
All right. So let me move on. Dr. Marwa, what's your take on this? Is this the situation that essentially underlines that Sudan is once again back to square one?
Well, I would say I can't agree. Thank you for having me. I can't agree more with what Mr. Mclad said, that the Transition Military Council never had good intention about handing the power to civilians. They are bluffing. We expected that they would reject this proposition, giving different reasons, whether merging with the African Union proposal, and tomorrow they will come with another reason. Their main reason is they are refusing any proposal that will take off their power.
So essentially, they're just trying to, these are what Mr. Mclad said, that these are essentially delaying tactics. They're never going to hand over power to the civilians.
That's correct. This is what we think. But the only way we have is to corner them through using all the peaceful available means.
Which is demonstrations.
As he mentioned, that there is a call for continuous of demonstration. We've come far, and we will. Sudanese people realize that if our demands are not met.
But the demonstrators themselves must be, Dr. Marwa, so afraid right now. They must be scared because, let's face it, June 3rd was a bloody massacre in Sudan. I mean, there were hundreds who were killed. And analysts are saying Sudan right now is in the grip of the RSF militia.
Well, that is true. And the intention of these militias who their act was endorsed by the Transitional Military Council is to intimidate people. So they choose either between their security and safety or achieving their demands, which is a civilian-led government.
Okay.
What we're saying, our message to the Transitional Military Council is that we will not be cowed. People are coming now out. There is a big demonstration we are calling out for on the 30th of June, which is the anniversary of this dictatorship, which we think the Transitional Military Council are people and it's the same regime with a different faces. The same criminals who committed wars in Darfur, and now they're committing the same crimes in Khartoum. People will come out in millions. We will continue our all peaceful means to force this government out, for them to hand the rule to a civilian government.
All right. Okay.
We will also rally the international community to exert more pressure, because this government is supported by a regional government.
Right.
And until we reach what we are out for,
the demonstrations are going to continue. Dr. Marwa, thank you so much for your valuable time there, giving us an insight on how these demonstrations are being planned across the Khartoum and across Sudan. Here we're also joined by Mr. Rashid Sid Ahmed. He's a Sudanese Communist Party member. He's joining us from London. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Mr. Rashid. We're talking about an impasse which has again come in between the military junta and the Sudanese. And right now, do you feel like the international community could play a constructive role in breaking this impasse?
Thank you for having me again. Yes, I agree that there is more than one leverages to change the impasse in Sudan. The main thing is the determination and perseverance of our Sudanese revolutionary forces in Sudan, and of course the international pressures on the TMC to hand over the state back to the civilians is important. The other thing is, from what I gathered from your distinguished guests, Dr. Marwa and Dr. Mclad, I gleaned some idea about the previous questions, that the council is adamant not to pass the packet to the Sudanese revolutionaries, and this is actually being expected from day one.
From day one. But do you think, let me just interrupt you here, is there any possibility, even if they are offering to merge two options, two plans, do you think there's any wiggle room with the opposition that they might come on board?
Well, opposition and the freedom and change, I mean, they are just acting upon the will and the wish and the demand of the people. And the demand of the people is a civilian rule. If this is being passed to us without having these obstacles of having them on the helm to continue the previous deposed regime and to reactivate the deep state, which has been built through 30 years, then there is no problem in that. But actually, we believe they are not, because they are puppets of the Muslim movement inside Sudan, and from some regional powers who have got vested interest to keep the military on top.
And that's a big problem. We're talking about regional powers who have quite a sway in how Sudan's future pans out, in terms of there's no dearth or financial support coming from them. And also this complete blackout of the internet, or reports barely is trickling out of Sudan. This really does come in the way. It really puts out the question, how long can these demonstrators sustain themselves in protesting in basically a blackout situation?
Well, as long as it takes. I mean, you cannot come from the mid of this path, and you cannot have a nap or a siesta while the war is waging. So there is no, we have crossed the Rubicon, my dear. We have crossed the Rubicon. There is no way back. And some of the international powers or groups, they are doing something, but actually we don't need only cacophonous, hurly-burly hot air. We need a real pressure on the regime. The African unity, actually, on the 30th of this month, the time will pass for that leeway they gave them, and it coincides with the 30th anniversary of the coup d'etat, and there is a preparations for a large demonstrations. And I'm using this platform to make the world aware, as if they are taking us back up to 1920s or 1930s. This cannot work in this Sudan. And the blackout is
this is also taking probably a massive sort of impact on an already suffering economy of Sudan, which was essentially how this all started back in December last year.
True, but we are in a revolution, my dear. I mean, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot revolt and you don't expect to pay prices. This is finger-biting sort of war. Whoever shouts first or whoever screams first loses.
Right. And it is a matter of time, essentially, how this pans out as the world watching on this, what will happen in Sudan, as we are expecting very soon these demonstrations to begin on June 30th. Any kind of preparations that are in way in terms of breaking the kind of blackout that the military has imposed on the Sudanese?
Well, there is some pressures being applied on the international forces and to pressurize the companies, the servers owners. But this is not actually complete blackout. There is so many ways of us to get informations and to pass it out. Whatever you know now and we know now is actually being filtered from Sudan.
I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it at that. Very quickly, Dr. Ahmed, I want to get your remarks on something we wanted to touch earlier on the role that Ethiopia has played here. General Mohammed Hamdan, he said the mission of the Ethiopian envoy was essentially to pave the way for resuming talks. Do you think that chapter has closed, or is there still some hope there?
Since day one, we know that this chapter will be closed down by the military council. It's not going to go further because they already have the actual Sudanese people in front of them. They met with them inside the palace and they didn't agree. So even whoever comes forward with any idea or plan, the only idea that they will accept that if they will rule Sudan with no one sharing that with them, which will impossible happen. So I think we will come to a confrontation. We think the 30th of June this month will be a big confrontation, which will not be the last confrontation between protesters and the military council, but it will be one of the biggest.
One of the biggest.
We know at the end of the tunnel, we have big hopes for Sudan. We understand 100% that we will win. We have the whole Sudanese community.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it at that, Dr. Mclad. We've run out of time. And also, Mr. Rashid Sid Ahmed, Dr. Marwa, thank you so much for giving your time here on the inside situation of Sudan as they prepare for mass demonstrations June 30th after the Military Transitional Council rejected all offers on the table. And that's all the time we have for now. We've got to wrap it up. We'll see you tomorrow with another episode of The Newswire.